In this video I'm going to paint this river scene here with these wonderful reflections, wet in wet, graded washes going from the bottom up, some backlighting happening there. Now this isn't my painting, this is out of this little book here by Joe Francis Dowden, an English watercolor artist, and if you look him up he is still very active today. He paints beautiful watercolors, a lot of water, a lot of reflections, and this book is about reflections. That what attracted me, because that's something that I definitely can improve on. Now if you've learned watercolor painting before YouTube and the abundance of video tutorials, then you know that it's quite challenging just to follow someone's step-by-step instructions to get to a finished painting. I didn't quite nail it, but I'm happy with the outcome. I definitely learned a lot of lessons, something I can take into my next painting where I will be doing reflections and river scenes like that. So if you do have the book and want to have a video tutorial, then you're in the right place. And if you're just here because that is just a stunning painting and want to see me recreate it, then hang around. I've had a lot of fun doing it, so let's get painting. So I'm starting with a bright yellow. You can choose any kind of yellow. You can have a more lemony yellow if you wanted to have a cooler, more fresher look. Mine is a neutral yellow, meaning it's neither cool nor warm. It sits in between. And we're leaving the sky white because there is, this distinct feeling of the strong sunlight coming from the background. And this first yellow wash that we're putting down will just emphasize that. It will create a halo around any other greens we're going to put on top, and we can leave some gaps in the next layer of green so that that yellow will still come through, and that will just further enhance the brightness. Now I'm going to mix my river color, which is mostly ultramarine and then with a touch of Prussian blue or phthalo blue, just a really bright staining color. I'm going to be probably be more expressive with my color than I usually do because I want to try and stick to the reference that I've got in front of me. And I'm going to paint that first wash straight onto dry paper. I didn't wet it, which I usually do. I just wanted to have a little bit more control over how the water runs up the river. That's as funny as that sounds. Maybe not so funny, but we're trying to get a gradated wash going from dark blue to light blue towards the back. And in fact, that little corner there where I'm right now should almost be white. So I'm going to water that right down. But as we get closer to the bottom of the page, and therefore closer to the camera or the viewer, we want to make that really dark. So I've added stronger pigment, and while this is wet I can just continue to layer that up. Because wet and wet washes always dry so much lighter than what you think they do, I'm going to go even darker with a bit of indigo there, just dragging across a few ripples. I've let that completely dry and I'm covering the river off with a tissue. And now I'm trying to splatter my trees in there. That's how Joe's done it in his book. So I've tried a couple of different brushes to see if I could create that effect. I suppose you could stencil it with a sponge as well, but I'm going to try the splatter approach. But you can see this is fairly tedious. I feel like a drummer in a band at the moment, trying to count in my fellow band musicians there, but I'm not really getting a lot of pigment onto my trees. I give it one more good whack with my largest brush, and I get the idea of that might create a really nice splattery texture to, show individual leaves catching some of the sunlight, but it wasn't quite doing it for me. So now I'm just going to go in with a fairly wet brush and then just connecting those splatters into more cohesive shapes. I mean, splattering is a good start for this particular approach. Like you can splatter some random dots on your painting and then connect them with water and get more random shape than actually painting the outlines. And as you can see, I'm not dragging the brush and trying to paint in a traditional sense. I'm stippling because I do want to stick, to the idea of lots of individual textures in those trees that catch a lot of the sunlight. I've moved down to my smallest brush. Speaking of the brushes, this is a set of Fumui brushes that the brand has generously sent me after I'd done a video with their short handle brushes a while ago. As a thank you, they sent me another set of brushes, and these are synthetic mop brushes of various sizes. So I'm having a go with them on this painting, and they're great brushes, especially the larger ones, the mops. Carry a lot of water, very soft to use. I did struggle a little bit with the finer brushes. They just didn't quite get back to a nice point after they were wet. So I found it hard to paint really fine detail with it. Highly recommend the larger size brushes. They are fantastic round brushes. But yeah, when it comes to really fine tips, probably not my preferred choice. Sorry for me. I'm not taking any money, so I want to be honest with my review. Continue to layer up those trees there, and you can see that river wash, how that's nicely dried there with very dark at the bottom. I've dragged up that green a little bit into the trees, so just define those trees on the right hand side just a little bit. And there was a bit too much white for me from the first layer, so I'm going back in with some yellow just to close some of those gaps so that it's not too busy in that area. Now mixing an even darker green using the same sort of colors I've been using thus far: ultramarine blue, a bit of indigo, and my yellow. And now I'm painting in some shadows to define the light and the dark on that left-hand riverbank. This is an approach of painting I quite enjoy. It's quite meditative. Stipple away slowly, slowly. It's very low pressure. When you have to make bold brush strokes that stand on their own, there's a lot more pressure to get it right with one hand movement, and that always makes one a little bit nervous. But when we sort of layer up dots and splatters, there's a very, very low risk of getting it wrong. Right, now I'm wetting the part of the river again with clean water that the reflections are going to go in. And now I can start dropping in colors for the reflections. And I'm starting with yellow again. And that's because dropping a blue into yellow gives me more control over the color mixes rather than trying to put yellow into blue. My paper is currently flat, so that's why I lifted it up slightly just to direct the water a little bit better, how it flows on the page. And now I'm dropping in my blues so that it mixes into different greens on the page itself. Switching to a smaller brush, so I have a little bit more control and precision. I can see it's a bit too light. Again, the challenge of painting in the right value, in the right darkness when you paint wet in wet. Always thinking about it's going to dry at least 2 or 3 shades lighter. It's the main reason why you end up with, weak watercolors, especially when you're a beginner. It takes quite a bit of experience and practice to get the right strength of pigments so that you have vibrant and expressive watercolors and none of these weak, washed out paintings, of which I have got many. And to keep the water flowing, I'm going to re-wet my paper a little bit with my spritzer bottle. It's definitely something you should have always at hand when you paint in watercolor, because once the paper is too dry to continue to work, you have to stop, and you lost that opportunity to really mold and shape your wet in wet areas. Rather keep it wet for longer and not do anything with it than to let it dry out. When I look at the original, my reference, Joe's reflections are just marvelous. I'm probably a little bit too hesitant here. I'm covering what I'm painting. Unfortunately, that can happen sometimes with the way the camera's rigged, but I'm just mixed a really dark indigo and ultramarine mix, and I'm trying to strengthen the reflections even further in the foreground. And then also the shadows underneath the banks. That's what's going to give it a bit of definition. And you can see now it's starting to pull together. The picture is starting to make sense. We can figure out where the river banks are ending and the water and reflections are starting. Putting my paper flat on the table again because it was running a bit too much down the page towards the bottom. Gonna let that reflection wash settle just for a few minutes. So keep myself busy with building up a bit more texture in the trees there. And you can see how wet it still is, how shiny it is. Partly because I re-wet it with my little spray bottle. Where I pointed out, you can see that it's drying a little bit faster because at the bottom I've added more water and more pigment, especially if you have it on an angle so the water runs down to the bottom of your page. So the bottom is going to be much wetter than, say, the middle or the top of your painting. Brilliantly covering what I'm painting, but you can see I'm just drawing in some reflections of those trees, desperately trying to not make them too symmetrical. And that's why I let that reflection just dry up for a couple of minutes before I painted those tree reflections there. If it's too wet, obviously it would have just fuzzed out and blurred out too much. I want to have some definition to those calligraphy lines, and I'm also going to flick in a few more darker reflections at the bottom, adding another layer of depth, and to create that vignette so that we get drawn to the horizon line where it's the lightest point in the painting. So I'm just going to give that riverbank just that tiny bit of definition to help us read it a little bit better. And then connect that line across to the left hand side as well. And I'm going to add a bit of quinacridone gold into that reflection, so a few brush strokes. And now I'm taking a clean and dry brush, so I wipe the water out of, and then just dragging that in to create some ripples in the water. You have to be a bit careful with that so you don't drag the pigment around too much. You really just want to lift it out. And I didn't think it was quite strong enough, so I'm taking my trusty old credit card and then just scrape out a couple of lines. That really helps, again, us with the illusion of it being water. There's got to be some ripples here and there. Even in the most calm bodies of water, it helps with the illusion. And while I got my little scratcher out, I'm going to scratch out a few grasses on the bank. So obviously that hasn't completely dried yet. If you've not scratched out before, it's also a timing challenge, as so many things are in watercolor. Too soon and it will be too dark, and too late and you can't scratch it out again. I've got a bit of white gouache here and a really stiff brush because we're back to splattering. I'm doing the reverse now. I didn't quite get the effect that Joe achieved with his trees, but I wanted to reintroduce some of the light reflections on those trees, so I did it with white gouache. While I'm at it, I'm just going to add a few flecks in the water as well. I'm going to add a little bit of blue to my white gouache because I also want to just create a few more light ripples in that foreground. Apologies again that I'm covering the important bit, but you can see I'm just with a few flicks of my wrist just creating some calligraphy marks. Almost too much, but I think I just got away with it. Yeah, the two paintings side by side, I think I have captured the essence of it. Definitely learned some valuable lessons. Would love to know what you think in the comments, and thanks for watching.